biologists. Welcome to Unit 6 Evolution. We're about to start our Intro to Evolution Lesson 1 notes. But first, let's talk about why we saved evolution to be the very end unit. So, evolution requires us to have a really good understanding of ecology, heredity, and central dogma. So, we needed to finish those units before we could actually get to this one. Now, in Lesson 1, we're going to be doing a lot of sort of history of evolution before we actually talk about evolution. We need to know what came before in shaping this theory. And so we're going to want to get started today. Make sure that you have your notes prepared. It's going to be 2 pages of notes and then 1 page of practice. The practice is really easy. I know you can do it. And let's go on and get started.
Lesson 1, Introduction to Evolution. The geologists. James Hutton, he wrote the Principles of Geology, which explain the processes that changed Earth in the past and are still operating to the present. Now, Charles Lyell, he proposed that layers of rocks form slowly and that rocks are shaped by natural forces, like volcanoes and earthquakes, and that these have occurred over millions of years and shaped the Earth and are still occurring today. These 2 geologists helped sort of put us on this sort of road of looking at the geography and the geology of our Earth and figuring out what's happening. Let's talk about Lamarck. Now, Lamarck proposed that by acquired characteristics, organisms acquired or lost certain traits during their lifetime, that these traits can be passed on to their offspring. Over time, this process led to change in species like the long neck of a giraffe. We know that Lamarck's hypothesis is now known to be wrong. Most of his research came from his studies in the neck size of giraffe. So his thoughts were that if the giraffe needed to have a long neck to be able to feed on the food that it wanted to feed on, it would be able to keep stretching its neck. And then its longer neck would then also be inherited by its next. Why are we studying a guy that we know to be wrong? Because he sort of paved the way for what we now know as evolution. So he's forever remembered for proposing an incorrect mechanism of evolution. Sort of sad. He's known for being wrong. But he is the first to try to explain evolution. And this set the stage for Darwin to uncover what we now know. So Malthus was an economist, and he reasoned that if the human population continued to grow unchecked, sooner or later there would be insufficient living space and food, and insufficient food for everyone. Again, this is mainly talking about overpopulation. Charles Darwin, he wrote On the Origin of Species. He proposed evolution through natural selection. His theory still stands, and he is known as the father of evolution. Alfred Russel Wallace. He was a naturalist, like Darwin, who wrote an essay summarizing his thoughts on evolutionary change. The main thing that we don't usually see or hear about him very much is that although he was a contemporary, in other words, he was around the same time as Darwin and was doing his research, just happened to be on insects instead, Darwin got his work out first. And so Darwin ended up being able to publish, and because of that, first come, first serve, Darwin became the father of evolution. But Alfred Russel Wallace also provided really good information that helped support. Let's jump to our next page of our notes. Let's define it. First off, evolution, the process by which modern organisms have descended from ancient organisms. And theory. A theory is a well-tested explanation that unifies a broad range of observations and hypotheses and enables scientists to make accurate predictions about new situations. I want you to add something right in here. Theories can't be proven, but they can be disproven. Theories can't be proven, but they can be disproven. What we can do with theories is that we can support them with evidence. And so highly supported theories make it very unlikely that they will ever be disproven, and evolution is one of those. Darwin's journey. Okay, so we know that Darwin is the father of evolution, and we know that he published a paper with all of his findings. But how did he get those findings? So he joined a crew on the HMS Beagle and set sail for a voyage around the world. So he went all over. And during his travels, he was collecting evidence, organisms, taking observations that led him to propose the theory of evolution. Darwin observed that the characteristics of many animals and plants varied noticeably among the different islands of the Galapagos. So I want you to look over at that yellow dot on the map. That's where the Galapagos Islands are. They're right off, they're in the Pacific Ocean, right off the side of South America. And these islands are close together, but there were such vastly different organisms that it led to a lot of really good observations and experiments that Darwin was able to sort of run. Now, what did he see? Okay, so Darwin saw, first off, birds. He loved looking at birds. He loved looking at finches. He even has a whole entire set of birds called Darwin's finches. And what he saw is that these organisms, these birds, they had a lot of the same characteristics, different coloring, but specifically their beak size. Their beak size was very different depending on what kind of food was available on what kind of locations on the islands. And as you can sort of see in the image that you have, that different beaks make a bird more highly adapted to be able to eat certain types of food. And what he also was able to figure out is those types of foods happen to be more prevalent on those islands where you found those types of beaks. He also found some tortoises that had some very interesting shells. As you can sort of see, there was a domed shelled one, an intermediate that was sort of in between the domed and the saddleback, and then the saddleback. And you probably are wondering, how in the world does the saddleback even work? But we'll talk about that later. Now, this page, you don't need to write anything, but I do want you to listen. We're going to be covering about natural selection in lesson 2, or sorry, in lesson 3, but it's going to give us a good sort of like wrap around to be able to talk about mutations next. So natural selection means that some individuals survive better and have more offspring than others. And the conditions needed for natural selection, we need to have traits that vary across individuals. Individuals don't need to be exactly the same. These traits are heritable. They can be passed along through reproduction. Some traits are better than others. Where you're going to have, again, some favoring for one trait over another due to maybe abiotic or even biotic means. Individuals with better traits survive longer and are able to reproduce more times. For example, take a look at this lizard and this yellow grasshopper. A yellow grasshopper, obviously easier to spot, which means it's going to die more quickly than, let's say, a green grasshopper. So that variation of color is important in being able to camouflage that organism and allow it to survive longer. Now, let's talk about mutations. There is some importance to us knowing about mutations. We've talked briefly about them. The last mutation that we talked about in a lot of detail was sickle cell. And what we need to understand is we talked about natural selection having the need for new traits. Well, how do these new traits appear? They appear with mutations. Now, a mutation is a change in the sequence of bases in DNA or RNA. We've talked about that. If you accidentally mess up during any part of the cell division, whether that's DNA replication, during the crossing over, you don't get all of the chromosome in its right spot. You can also have mutations occur to your cells or damage parts of your cells with ionizing radiations like UV rays from the sun, exposure to certain types of chemicals, for example, carcinogens. Remember, we talked about how cancer was caused by cell division going wrong, the splitting going wrong. And again, this is some kind of mutation within one cell. You also have infections by viruses, HPV, EBV, hepatitis B, that can cause mutations or damage to your cells and actually also lead towards cancer. Now, here's the thing. Mutations are essential for evolution to occur. There are different types of mutations. You have germline mutations, somatic mutations. Germline are usually within the gametes. Somatic are your just body cells. So chromosome alterations, for example, you're supposed to have 23 pairs, but you only have 22, or you have only a partial chromosome when you should have a full one. Point mutations, that's when you have a substitution of a thing. So in other words, in your DNA, instead of having like CAG, you have CTG. So you have a substitution of a nucleotide, and that could be multiple or just one. Frame shift mutations is when you have an extra nucleotide accidentally thrown in there. So instead of a CAG, you might have CATG or CAAAG or CCG, and you get the point. You have extra letters thrown in. You also can have deletion. You can have just, instead of CAG, you can have just CG. Now, think about that. With what we know about protein synthesis and what we know about DNA replication, transcription, and translation, if you took out one letter in that process, it can throw off a lot of stuff. So frame shift mutations can be really, really dangerous. So can chromosome alterations in germline. So here's the thing. If a mutation doesn't actually change the protein produced, it's called a silent mutation. This, again, happens. And we see it. We talked about that when you have a change on just that third nucleotide, sometimes it doesn't change what protein's made. And as long as the same protein is made, then you're solid. Now, in your notes at the very beginning of this mutation part, you have individual organisms don't evolve, populations do. Keep that in mind. Start it. It's a great true-false question. A lot of times we'll ask, evolution happens on individuals, and that's false. Evolution happens on populations. You have to have a group of organisms that then again reproduce together to be able to see what traits are again moving forward. Mutations happen on individuals, not on populations. Let's summarize Darwin's theory. So first off, organisms differ. Individuals, they although look overall the same, there are certain traits and certain things that make each individual different from another, especially if they, again, are from unique gametes and sexual reproduction. Variation is inherited. These differences are inherited from parent to offspring. Organisms produce more offspring than survive. Sadly, this is the truth. You see overpopulation because you see a rabbit has tons and tons of babies, but the amount of babies that actually get to adulthood, surviving, having enough resources, having enough space, having enough water, and not getting eaten by predators, you're going to see a smaller amount actually make it to adulthood. Organisms compete for resources. We see this all the time. You have a resource, you've got some competition over it. If you have a lack of resource, you definitely have some competition over it. Organisms with advantages survive to pass those advantages to their children or offspring. We also see this, that organisms that are more successful at living, they have those advantages, they'll live longer, they'll reproduce more, and therefore pass that advantage on to their offspring. Lastly, species alive today are descended with modifications from common ancestors. So what we're saying is the species that we see around us today, we can backtrack either genetically through DNA or through other means, which we're going to talk about later in evidence of evolution, that there have been changes over time, but again, we can track them back to common ancestors. Yay, we're done! Almost. You have some practice to do. It's not going to take you very long. It's just some matching, but you're going to want to look at your first page of your notes to help you with that. Make sure that you have your notes and your practice done so that you can show it to your teacher next class. Have a great day!